Okay. I
Yeah.
guess you start saying something.
So that you don't have a horse to go at your boots. What is reform, or what should?
And we'll have to keep we have to keep quiet because sure. Go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, you want me to start? Okay. Well, Barry, now that your year as student co-president is almost up, maybe we could run over the year a little bit and see what's happened in the past year. There's been a lot of academic reform which has been initiated by students, which is almost practically new for Loyola. Could you explain a little bit how that's come about and what did you have to do with it as co-president of the LSA?
Well, I guess looking back over the year, it seems like a heck of a lot more than a year. I suppose it started personally for me when I first came here as a CJEP student. My first year here, I come out of high school. I guess like a lot of students coming out of high school, I expected big things from college. Mostly I expected the college to be able to adjust to my needs as a student. And one of the very first things I found when I came to Loyola was that the college, or the present CJEP system here, wasn't really willing to or able to adjust to my needs as an individual. That they were prepared to serve the mass and bulk of students in the center, the gray matter. Mm-hmm. But if you were white or black, you really didn't fit in. You were sort of outside the mainstream. And so that was really what got me involved in politics. It seemed to me that there had to be a way of changing that, unless I was prepared to be content and go through another high school type of situation where I was going to bend and do what the institution wanted and really not benefit myself. So that's how I personally got started. Why I got into student government was simply that it seemed to me that that's where the means were, the money was there, the office space was there, the telephones were there, and that if we had to initiate change, that's where it had to start. It seemed to me that the Student Association wasn't concentrating enough in that area. It would just emerge from 1969 and the troubles that were there, and I guess it was a period of reaction. And the Student Association was lacking direction at that time. And it seems to me that this money and the space and this potential could be put to much better use. And I got involved. It was a long process. It took a few years before you could really infiltrate any organization, I suppose. But I came in with a good group of people, and I wasn't alone. And once the crusade sort of started, within the building itself, within the LSA building, I found that we had a lot more allies than we had originally anticipated, and people came out from everywhere and offered their support, and that's how it started anyway.
Well, as far as academic reform is, could you explain a little bit what is meant by it and how it was first initiated in the LSA this year?
Well, to begin with, it's I think our demands were really very modest. They were looked upon as radical at the time, but they certainly weren't. They were very modest reforms. We were talking about institutional change, forcing the institution to adjust to the student. And our first demands were in the area of CJEP were things like elimination of compulsories, new grading systems, and implementation of different, more innovative types of courses. In other words, allowing students and professors to develop their own types of courses. Now that's where it started. Now, of course, I guess like any movement, it built up its own momentum. And we found that a lot of people across the college had a number of ideas about reform. But basically it was institutional reform. In other words, you change the institution, you change the laws, you change the structures. Changing the people was a more complex problem, and we're still working on that, really. You can only change the structures to a certain extent, but beyond which you can't go any further, and you have to bring the rest of the population up and allow them to adjust to the changes, and that's as far as we've gone now. But as far as reform, we're talking about institutional reform.
Have you had much of a problem with reform as far as apathy in students is concerned? Have you found that the students have been helping you along? Do you have support from the college, or are you sort of working in your own little bureau of?
Well, I'd say that in comparison with other colleges and universities, that we do have support. I think that one of the problems there is that we work with about 100 students.
Mm-hmm.
It's about 100 students that make things happen or not happen on campus, and that's the people that work in the Student Association. And out of 4,000, that's not really that many. In comparison, we'll say with Sir George or McGill, it's probably a lot per capita. Reform is complex. University reform is complex, and therefore requires, unfortunately, a form of specialization that is inclined to make you depend on student bureaucrats, student politicians. They become almost non-students, and that's been part of our problem. In the area of reform, what we found was that we had to concentrate on attacking the institution. I mean, in the past, students would sit back and say, well, look, I want this changed, but I'm not sure what I want changed or how I want changed, and least of all, I certainly don't know how to go about changing it.
Mm-hmm.
So the first step we had to do was figure out how to beat the institution. How do you beat Senate? How do you beat the deans? And it can be done. So it's only a matter of putting enough money and time and expertise into the area, and you can win. But you have to beat one system with another. So we had to end up designing a complex system of caucus meetings, of lobbying, of research, mostly of research. I think that was the one area we concentrated on. In other words, if you want something changed, if you want an independent study program or a para-academic program or interdisciplinary study program or to create new courses or create alternatives or eliminate compulsories, new grading system, you have to start by saying why it should happen, what some of the repercussions will be, how this will change the institution, how the institution has to adapt, how much it will cost the institution. These are questions that past students didn't answer. In fact, many cases didn't ask, and faculty aren't going to answer them for you, because faculty now are having destroyed the tyranny of the administrations in the 60s, have now established their own tyranny, and they're really not interested in change. They're afraid of change, so you can't count on faculty to come through. Sometimes you can count on administration, but usually it's students that have to do it themselves. The problem there is that you build an efficient organization that can do this, that can win in conflicts with faculty and administration and get material through Senate, but they're on such a level, it's such a complex issue that you're inclined to leave behind the mass of students, because it's no longer a case of slogans of repeal this or the universal vote or universal suffrage. The issues are so much more complex that the average student has to take an awful lot of time to sit down and read them. It's the same problem with politics. The average person in the street really doesn't understand politics because he hasn't, in many cases, the time or the interest to really read about what legislation is. So all he reads is the headlines. So the students are inclined to do the same thing. And our problem is communicating it, because unless you're able to obtain their support, unless you're able to show muscle every once in a while on an issue, you'll lose. Eventually, figure you're a paper tiger. And that was a problem. It was a problem.
What kind of difficulties did you encounter as far as getting students in on the political scene, such as Senate and things like parity on committees? Did you have much of a problem?
Well, yeah, I'd say we had a problem because students are inclined. I think there's a certain the idealism of the 60s has been replaced by the cynicism of the 70s. So students are inclined to say, I haven't got time for that type of thing, or it's a lot of bull, and it's politics, and it's not what I want to do. And the problem there is to convince enough students that not only can you bring about reform, but that they'll benefit from it. In other words, if you want to control your own destiny, you have to simply reach out and change it. You have to be prepared to take that extra step. And I mean, the world is any society is capable of change if you just have enough gumption to go out and change it. The question is to convince students who are turned off towards the system, because we're not really offering the type of radical. We're not offering. Well, in some cases we ask them to go to the streets, but usually we ask them to go to Senate meetings, and it's different, and it's more complex, and it's boring at times, especially if you don't understand it. And you bring a student in who was turned off towards systems, and you say, well, we want to fight this system by building another system, and there's a sort of hostile reaction. And we were lucky. We did end up with 100 people, and they made things happen. We certainly could have used 200 or 300. But
well, now that you're facing the end of your term, have you feel you've accomplished some of the goals that you set out for, or are you satisfied with the way the year has ended out? Do you feel you could accomplish a lot more?
Oh, I'm satisfied with what we've done in the last year and a half, nearly 2 years. We've got a great deal through, going back as far as beginning with the CJEP reform and going through to the mail-in registration systems and into things like para-academic credit and independent studies and interdisciplinary studies. These are areas which students have directly incorporated into the system at Loyola, and I think have brought about substantial change. I think there's a lot more that can be done in the areas of, say, course evaluation, where, by the way, I think we lead the country in that area.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still a lot to be done. There's a lot of things that remain to be done. But I'm satisfied with what we've accomplished. I think it's up to new people. We really can't stay around. I think there's a certain moral responsibility to step out and let new people come in who have new and fresh ideas. We had some ideas when we came into government, and we've accomplished most of what we set out to do. It's now up to, I think, new people to come in and offer perhaps new directions. One of their priorities is obviously going to be to bring the mass of students and faculty up to the level we are now. I think there's a limit beyond which you can't push any further without bringing the population with you. And we may be reaching that saturation point. I don't know whether that's true or not. But,
Well, getting into something more specific, there's a lot of controversy going around about mandatory course evaluation. Could you explain a little bit more about what course evaluation is and how it affects the students and faculty here on campus?
Yeah, sure. Well, course evaluation is a means by which students can evaluate a course that they're taking, evaluate their reaction to the course, whether they like the course, whether they feel the professor was relaying the information the way it should be, whether they got along with the professor. In other words, it gives I don't think it's a total answer to improving courses, but it does give the professor and the students future students who are considering going to that course, an idea of what the course is like and some of the problems they're likely to encounter, and the professor's personality. Some of the problems with course evaluation is that faculty are interested in evaluating students, but not particularly interested in having themselves evaluated. It's sort of a double system there. It's a double-edged sword. I think when they became involved in evaluations, they should have expected this. It's been CAUT, which is the teachers' union, teachers' association, has accepted the fact that course evaluations are here to stay, that they're important to the institution, and certainly one of the key factors in improving courses in the future. Our evaluation, which, like I said, is probably the best in the country, is improving and changing every day to adjust to faculty needs and to student needs. And I think we'll continue to see changes in that area for years to come. But I think most important, we can expect a lot of faculty to resist it. Faculty, I guess by some quirk of fate, have become more reactionary elements on campus. In many cases, there are a lot of faculty who support reform, but many who oppose it because they feel threatened by it, and they feel most threatened by course evaluation. Unfortunately, most of the professors that are threatened by course evaluation are those professors who get poor course evaluations. Unfortunately, they don't view it in the right light. I think their attitude should be that, well, there's a problem. How can it be solved? It may not be a problem of his ability to put across the material. It may simply be a personality thing. It may be that the course is 1 year old, and that there's a lot to be learned. It may be that he's going too fast for the students or too slow for the students, so that the material is irrelevant to the student. What he has to accept is that the student is giving him a reaction, and if the reaction is negative, the faculty shouldn't say, well, the students don't know this material. I know this material. Therefore, I know what I'm doing. I know what is best. That attitude belongs back in the 1950s. They should take it as a gut reaction, and they should react accordingly, saying, well, how do I improve the course? That's the question. I think the administration is willing to adopt this attitude and saying, well, there's a problem, let's solve it. Not there's a problem, let's punish the professor. Not there's a problem, let's punish the students. It's a cooperative thing. Education is a cooperative thing these days, and it's got to...
Has there been proof in the past that this evaluation has actually helped students in their courses, in the future courses?
Yeah, there's a lot of proof, and CAUT in their report on that stated that evaluations were accurate in their findings, and that the professors should look at them as being accurate in their findings. But I guess my gut reaction would be to say that during our mail-in registration last summer, we had negligible returns until we sent out the course evaluation booklet. In other words, students said, I'm not going to risk going into that course until I find out how other students reacted to it. So from a student point of view, it's invaluable. It's invaluable.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Barry. Enjoyed your...
You're welcome.
Okay, will you stay there, please?
Something quite intelligent right there. Did you get across what you wanted to get across?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm inclined. Can't be talking.
That's good. No, you have to listen to me. Once in a while, it's good for a guy to have to shut up.
Seriously, attentively listening to her.
If I had something intelligent to tell you, I would.
That's enough. We'll get it. Let's get it. We didn't miss it, but shadows were going to go right into course evaluation, all right?
Okay,
And we're just going to do about 5-6 minutes.
fine.
Okay. And watch me proceed, please.
Okay.
Because, I want some time.
Alain, as educational vice president this year, you must be actively involved in the academic reform.
Oh, that's okay.
You ruined my intro. Go ahead. Okay. Alain, you're educational vice president of the LSA this year, so you must be fairly well actively involved in academic reform, which has been student initiated. To go into something a little bit specific, the students have come out with mandatory course evaluation. I wonder if you could explain exactly what it means and how it works.
Well, let me go a bit into the history of course evaluation and why it had to be mandatory. Course evaluation in the United States has been an established thing for tens of years. But here in Canada, it was only begun over the last 3 or 4 years. And we started at Loyola 3 years ago. That means that it's not an accepted kind of procedure. In the States, whereas some universities spend 10% of their budget, we really had very little funding. That means that it's still at the stages of being accepted. The second thing why it had to be mandatory was that it's being used now in deliberations about professors' contracts and so on. And so you've got to have a standard measuring device that applies to all professors if you're going to be getting into serious things like contracts. Some professors are very uneasy in getting evaluated when they know that other professors aren't getting evaluated.
How do you mean it has to do with the professors' contracts?
Last year, Senate, which is the group of professors and administrators and students that makes all the top decisions on campus, decided that the review board, which does what it says, it reviews the files of all the professors and decides whether they'll get their contract renewed, whether they'll get merit increases and so on, that this body should take into account the student evaluation.
I see.
It's been strange because evaluation has a number of functions. One, it's supposed to provide information for students on courses, the impressions of other students who have already taken the course. Secondly, it's got this input into contractual negotiations. And thirdly, it's supposed to improve the effectiveness, of the actual course, the teaching.
Does it do these three things?
Well, because it's so new, it really hasn't expanded itself into all of those three areas. I'd say for it to improve the effectiveness in courses, you've got to have real cooperation with faculty and students and administration, which just hasn't solidified yet this year. It's coming. And here at Loyola, I think over the next 2 years, you're going to be having a course evaluation. It's really useful. Right now, there's been a lot of defensive reactions, both on the part of faculty who perhaps aren't getting good evaluations, and also on the part of students who don't realize the impact of evaluation and don't realize that this is the only instrument they have for channeling in their impressions of their education. And so you have students being very laissez-faire about course evaluation and not defending it.
Well, course evaluation is such as what? A piece of paper with 40, 50 questions on it? Does it really concern what the professor is worried about? And does it concern the course? Does it concern his attitudes? Or
Up until now, it's been a questionnaire. It's a validated questionnaire, which means that professional people, for us, the McGill Center for Learning and Development, which is the only group in all of Canada that puts professional attention on methods of education and evaluation of education, they've spent a lot of time and they've come up with the only validated questionnaire that exists in Canada. The only other validated questionnaire that exists was made in 1950 at Purdue University in the United States. It's a questionnaire that asks questions about the teacher's methods, about his effectiveness, about even his tone of voice, whether he's considered a fair marker, whether the books were good, whether the labs, if the course involved labs, were good, all aspects of the course.
I see.
And it doesn't mean to come up with a single statement about the course of the professor, but kind of like a profile that can be used for information by other students when they're selecting courses, by contractual people, and hopefully by the professor in perfecting his course.
Do the students feel as if the questions cover exactly what they want to say about the course, or is there some type of a question on the questionnaire which covers maybe a student's own opinions about something?
There are very general questions on this year's questionnaire that asks, why did you take this course? It's important to get that initial information. If the student was just taking it for a credit, then he might be tempted to give a bad evaluation because he's frustrated. And then there's another question: were you overall satisfied with the course? And then there's questions about the questionnaire. Did you think that this questionnaire reflects your feelings about the course? Were you given enough privacy and so on? There's all kinds of really intricate things involved in evaluations.
Well, so far I know that there's a bit of controversy between faculty and students as far as this evaluation is concerned. What about the students? Are they sort of all together about this? Do they all agree that it should be?
I can't think of one thing that students are all together about, period. We've gone through quite an extensive campaign to promote the idea of evaluation. It does need promoting because it's not one of those things that students are getting together outside the campus and rabble-rousing about. In many ways, getting evaluation through has not been attained by gathering large crowds of students. It's been attained by politicking and committee work and getting votes in the Senate and that. So.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. We enjoyed listening to your views.
Oh, you're welcome.
Like, one's Barry. Okay. I think I must have made a lot of noise at the mic. I kept bumping and booting against the table.
Really?
It's a habit I have. I don't know if it showed. I noticed I was doing it once, so I stopped.
You shouldn't even put your feet on it.
Yeah, okay.
Of course, evaluation is funny. It sounds like a great issue, but really kind of deadpan.
Right.
That seems to me to be really much more valuable than what the discussion is.
Well, you see, this is interesting, but it's not working as well. This is boring as usual, mind you. At least we know why he's doing his grant. That's what he was trying to tell us to begin with.
Yeah, we're going to do
We should know what he's aiming at.
Yeah.
I've been working with Alan this year in the educational department of the LSA. For instance, you went to an educational conference, or you sort of organized this conference. Could you tell me a little bit more about what went on and what the results were?
I think as Barry mentioned earlier in the program, most of our endeavors in the area of academic performance stem from research which was done over the summer. This year I made a field trip to various colleges in the United States, and out of that we felt the need to examine alternative structures and various different methods of educational technique which were being used in other areas of Canada and the United States. So we planned an education conference held here in November. It's the first one of its kind which Loyola had ever had. In terms of its positive effects, I guess there are many. I think one of the simplest ways to do it is that we've been able to lock into a variety of programs existing within other institutions. The clearest example that comes to mind would be our experimental course, Student as Decision Maker, which we're taking down to one of the colleges, which we had down to suggest we're taking down there this coming weekend. So that would be an example of immediate effect. But as think one of the other realizations we came to was that a lot of the programs that we regard as innovative or reform have been programs that have been in operation for years. For example, independent studies just came into Loyola this year, but colleges like Goubout or Hofstra have had it for 14 years. So I think we've come to realize exactly how we fit into the whole sphere of innovation with regards to other institutions.
Who was involved?
Just hold for a second. You're not smiling at me, just listening to me. Right. And now I would like this student decision making I'd like you to elaborate on that. All right, don't go into the other areas.
Yes, I did.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Sandy, ask him.
Okay. Could you explain a little bit more about this example you brought up, student as a decision maker? What's it all about?
Student decision maker is a student-run course. Alain has been the coordinator. It's being taught by students like myself, other students in Loyola, as well as a few faculty members. I guess basically what it involves is an attempt to help incoming students, stage students, understand what decision making is about and how it affects their role in education. It's an examination of various types of education, sessions on high school, on stage, on alternative structures, student activism. And basically what it attempts to do is to teach students what a decision means and what decision making means in terms of education.
You say students are teaching this course. What kind of experience do you have to back them up?
I guess if you're talking in terms of concrete things like curriculum vitae and other such measurements of qualification, I guess none. But in terms of everyday experience and feeling the same type of frustrations with this system, which is really geared to meet mass needs and not individual needs, I think they're the highest possible qualifications in that sense.
I see. Students who are into this course this year, is it supposed to help them become, let's say, less apathetic than they have been in the past? Does it have anything to do with student government, or is it government in general, and politics?
I don't think it has that much to relate to student government, except in the sense that most of the people teaching it are in student government, so in that sense it makes students more aware of what student government at Loyola is all about. But basically it deals with education and the various ways in which decisions are made in education and the ways in which we as students affect these type of decisions. One of the most positive things I would hope would come out of the course would be that students would realize that in order to make a decision involves certain implications and certain responsibilities, and an extension of that is to make a decision you have to be providing an alternative and not just in this decision to negate something that already exists.
Was the students' interest aroused when this course was being offered this year?
I think it has. To say that the course has been a complete, utter success would be untruthful. I think that's a product of any experimental program, is you have to give it a couple of years and test it. We've gone like full swing in some areas. The first session or module modules last 3 weeks, and there are 8 of them, and the students have to pick out of 4. So that's a bit of a throwaway from the traditional method of instruction. The first module lacked no structure, which is general discussion groups, no readings, no or anything, and students didn't like that. And now we've come around to the last module, which is mine, which is the most highly structured. So in a sense, we've come full swing from a complete freedom to the type of structuring that occurs in classes which are being taught as normal courses. So we realize certain things about that with regards to student needs.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you.
No, actually, I'm the one who's supposed to talk.
Yeah.
It's actually the most attentive.
You're gonna be smiling and everything. Ready, okay. First of all, Don, I'd like to congratulate you on your
Thank you.
elections. You've become the student president of Loyola. I'd like to ask you, your campaign, you were mentioning, has sort of an overall theme, which is the solidity of what's happened in the past as far as reform is concerned. Could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think Barry was mentioning earlier all the things that have happened in the academic sphere here at Loyola, all the reforms that have been initiated. And I think he also mentioned the idea that because there's been so much, people aren't really aware of it because they have so many alternatives to choose from. So I think what we're looking for this year is to solidify and to bring together a lot of the things that have already been initiated. For example, like the whole CEGEP reform from last year has to be looked into, has to be evaluated, has to be investigated. Course evaluation has to be made much more positive. You have to take a much more positive look at it in terms of the seeing it as one facet of a total learning experience. I think also students have to be made much more aware of the alternatives that they have. That there's a lot of stuff they can get into. There's a lot of different courses they can get into, but they aren't really familiar with it. I think that's the important thing is to communicating it to them.
Do you intend to keep this within sort of the school limits, or do you want to bring it out into the open now and have the sort of the community aware of what's happening at Loyola?
Well, that would depend how you define community. The way I look at it mainly in terms of other student bodies, other CEGEPs, other universities, other colleges. I think an initial step has already been made in that direction. I mean, Loyola for the past 2 years has been quite involved with national student unions and provincial student unions, and also has been quite involved with the students at Sir George in light of the merger coming up. So I think we have to sit down and really look, what is Loyola's role both in Quebec, in Canada, and, in terms of academics. What does Loyola have to offer to other institutions, essentially? The community at large here near Loyola, I think they already feel the presence of Loyola, but I think they have to feel the presence of Loyola as a very sort of unique institution.
How can you bring this out into the open?
I think without going into the merger, I think the merger will do a lot for it. I think the fact that you have a new university and you have two different trends, one here at Loyola and one down at Sir George, two different types of education, I think will do a lot for it. So, students have the alternative, and I think students will be able to choose much better, in terms of a technical course or a liberal arts course.
Do you intend to continue along with the academic reform that's been happening in the past, or do you want to go into a more social thing this year and sort of improve social standards here at Loyola?
Well, the theme of our campaign was twofold. One was the thing about academic reform, but academic reform in terms of bringing together what we already have, not going off on other research projects, not going off on other reforms. We have to sort of come together and solidify, like I said before, what we have already. And the second theme being that I think a whole area which has sort of lacks control or lacks investigation by students is the whole area of campus services, very practical things like eating facilities, like the library, like the bookstore, like the athletics, like financial aid. These are very practical aspects that touch the student. And I think before we can talk about academic reform, I think we have to hit the student where he really feels the need for it, and that's in the area of student services, I think, essentially. So it's a dual function, I think. You could call it social to that extent.
Can there be a lot of improvements, or are there a lot of improvements that should be made as far as the social atmosphere is concerned here at Loyola, as far as student services are concerned?
Definitely. I think a lot of interesting questions have been raised lately in terms of things like athletics, in terms of spending priorities for sports here at Loyola, in terms of how many students really get financial aid from the government, or is it just a minority? I know of students who have dropped out of school because the government hasn't, given them money, but that's a whole political issue involved. Things like we recently had the CAF boycott, the eating facilities here on campus have to be investigated. The library, the sort of poor quality of the library in terms of books has to be, upgraded. So I think a lot of things are involved, essentially.
Do you think because Loyola is such a unique college in that we're small, first of all, that it has a lot to do, you can work with a lot better people, not better people so much, but the smaller atmosphere and the smaller number of people helps?
I think it's essential. I think the fact that we've been able to go so far has had a lot to do with the fact that we're so small, that you can walk into an administrator's office and sit down, and talk things over with him. Try McGill, and that wouldn't happen. It's just out of the question. I think the fact that it's so informal also has had a lot to do with a lot of the things that have been happening here, because you don't get lost in a maze. There is a maze, but it's not that big. You know how to beat the system, essentially, and you can get what you want and do it in a positive way. I think it's essential. And I think also the thrust of the learning experience here at Loyola, which is so, we call it liberal arts, but liberal arts means a lot, and it is liberal arts here, has a lot to do with it also. You're not dealing with highly technical schools, so you can afford to experiment, you can afford to change things, you can afford to question things, and bring in alternatives.
The LSA is working on an advertising campaign sort of to bring up its own standards, to make the students realize more what the LSA is all about. Do you think that this is going to come across? Do you think the students are becoming more aware of what the LSA is?
I think the students know that the LSA exists. Now, how they envision the LSA is another story. I think it depends who you talk to also. I think, your average student may not be very familiar with the LSA, because I think you have to realize that a lot of the work, let's say, that goes into certain things like CEGEP reform is done behind the scenes, because there's so much involved that you can't dealing with a small group, a small, very committed group. I think the LSA has improved drastically. I mean, since I've been here 2 years already, has improved since I came in, since I first got involved. It's taken a whole new thrust to it. It's taken a whole new thrust in terms of being present, in terms of dealing with very concrete issues, and in terms of making things happen and making things change. And I think that's what's important, both in terms of academics and also in terms of the kinds of services that the students get here on campus.
Do you think that this campaign is going to bring about more student involvement in the LSA?
Hopefully. We've always had the problem, I think any student government has the problem of a desperate shortage of students that are involved. But the fact that we have so many posts to fill on things like academic committees of Senate and other things around the college, I think this year we've done a good job. We've recruited at least 100 and something people. I mean, people who are committed to working. All we can say is, hopefully students will respond to the fact that we're asking them to get involved for their own sake, to change things for them. And essentially, it boils down that if we don't have the manpower, we can't do anything.
Okay, Don, thanks very much for your
Sure.
opinions.
Yeah, and not talk.
Is somebody going to be doing the hostel this year?
Lionel, are you free today?
Yeah. Where?
Here.
Okay.
We need something.
Give you a hand.
Angela?